Hi everyone, this is Max. I'm with the European Timezone Meetup group, and today we're going to be reading Ars Poetica by Archibald MacLeish. Ars Poetica. A poem should be palpable and mute as a globed fruit, dumb as old medallions to the thumb, silent as the sleeve-worn stone of casement ledges where the moss has grown. A poem should be wordless as the flight of birds. A poem should be motionless in time as the moon climbs, leaving as the moon releases twig by twig the night-entangled trees, leaving as the moon behind the winter leaves, memory by memory the mind. A poem should be motionless in time as the moon climbs. A poem should be equal to, not true, for all the history of grief, an empty doorway and a maple leaf. For love, the leaning grasses and two lights above the sea. A poem should not mean, but be. So, yeah, I mean, if Mary were here, I would ask her for her first, her rationale for picking this. But I think I want to start by asking what. So imagine this is like a ModPo collaborative close reading, and imagine Al is here. And what is the first question Al would pose about this poem? So what would be like the first?
The title?
But like a sure. What does the title mean? Yeah, that's a good guess, Vijaya. But maybe something more specific. What would Al like say? What would he?
There is no this in it.
Right.
I think I would like to say a poem should not mean but be. So
Yes.
how are we going to dig into it like this?
Yes.
That's true.
Yes.
Yeah.
But is there?
Well,
Looking for one more specific.
how is this poem fit into this week? We're doing this week of language poetry, right?
Sure. Well, we're sort of, we're kind of going off the script a little bit. So this isn't like.
So this poem that rhymes and uses similes, how does this fit into language?
Right. So okay. So you're getting us closer there, CJ. So this poem that uses rhyme and simile, and right. Okay. So what is like? I don't know. What I don't know. I don't know how to ask more leading questions without giving away. So what I would guess that Al would ask something like, does this poem do what it says? And I think that so famously in ModPo, we sort of don't have many poems that have like rhyme and simile and these very traditional poetic devices. We tend to have poems that don't have those for various reasons. But the rhyming, the form of this poem, is this poem doing what it says? I'm just going to put that question out there.
No, it's too many. It's so wordy.
Okay, so it's too wordy to be a sort of like object that just is.
It doesn't just be. It's got flocks of birds flying all around.
Okay. Maybe more instances of this poem doing or not doing what it says.
Well, the fact that what is it? A poem should be motionless in time as the moon climbs. That it says that twice is doing what it says by the repetition.
It also says a poem should be wordless as the flight of birds. So it's kind of maybe it's kind of ironical.
That's okay. That's a good point, Vijaya. Maybe something for us to consider, like how sincere is this poem, or how sincere can it be, or is what it's proposing somehow like very difficult to attain?
I have a thought. Did anyone read Homer's 400 pages about what Ars Poetica really is, to him anyway.
To Homer,
I
no.
only know a summary.
No.
Did anybody go back to Horace in 19 BC who produced the first Ars Poetica? Not me, I just found out he did it.
I also did not go back to Horace, who inaugurated the tradition.
And I said Homer, but I meant Horace. It's
Oh, okay.
Oh, fine. I thought
Bert?
perhaps they both had a shot at it.
I have a proposition. I
Yeah.
like this line, a poem should be wordless as the flight of birds. But here he is using words, but on the other hand, he is presenting a flight of birds. So the image, we are in the image of a flight of birds. So we have left the words.
That's okay, yeah.
So I think in that way, he is true to his words. The question I guess I would say is there something besides producing image that is wordless? Is there other ways of being wordless?
Yeah.
The question,
Oh, go
the
ahead.
question is what does he mean by wordless?
Well, I think it means it promotes a thought that we hold. That are
Yes.
wordless. Okay.
A poem should be wordless. A word is something with meaning. Is meaning important in a poem? The poet says no. Maybe he refers to sounds. A poem should be full of sounds, like the flight of birds when you hear the birds flying.
Right.
But then he's also saying it should be mute. So he's very contradictory.
But he also says
Thank you so much.
not true.
Sorry, Lee, can you say that again?
He also says it should be equal to. I'm sorry. It should be equal to not true. So maybe that's kind of what we're getting at. It's saying so many things that it's not.
that line, I couldn't figure out why he had, punctuation there. A poem should be equal to, but not true.
Ah,
I didn't understand that line at all.
Maybe he says it has to be a representation, not an exact similitude, and just like, just a general kind of.
Yeah, it shouldn't present facts.
Yeah, to me, it's a reference to Boolean algebra, where you have the ones and the zeros, true, false, not true.
Or as opposed to prose, because prose can be true, right? You have nonfiction in prose, but like here, he doesn't want the actual reality to be presented, like a mirror reflection, not exactitude. I don't know.
right. So Mark, the point about the colon, sort of this algebraic, almost mathematical function, I think is spot on. And it reminded me of, so for those of us who took the SATs in the US, we may have fond or not so fond memories of the endless syllogisms that you're supposed to learn. A:B as C:D, and you're supposed to fill in, it's a way of doing vocabulary. So it's always divided with a colon. The colon is a sort of like equals sign, this kind of like, this the sort of the pivot on which the comparison is made. So that's sort of how I'd understood the presence of the colon there, the punctuation, because the poem should be equal to colon, not true. I mean, but there's also a ton of ambiguity there, right? Like, right, we can say that the poem should be not true. Wait, well, I don't know. It's actually, it's a little bit hard to piece out when you actually start like to make sense of when you start to spend time with it. I mean, I like what you said, Lee, about it's sort of, it's not presenting facts. So it's not interested in like truth or questions of veracity. But then I don't know if MacLeish would say that a poem is not interested in truth.
Logic, maybe that's the
yeah.
logic.
Yeah, logic and facts. It's not interested in facts, maybe.
But we might say that poetry often is more true than the prose that's trying to tell the truth.
Sure.
In a metaphorical sort of way.
Right. A poem is not interested in like procedurally in laying out truth or veracity, right? It's not like a poem shouldn't be assembling terms and you know, performing a sort of deduction or something, saying like because A then B, because B then C, therefore A leads to C, or something like that. I think maybe that's sort of the kind of truth that he's calling into question.
What about that line, dumb as old medallions to the thumb? I mean, what does that mean?
That's a good question.
Well, what?
Familiar, like you
Hmm.
rub a coin and
Yeah.
Dumb, yeah, I mean, dumb in that they don't speak, right? I mean, this fits with the muteness, there's muteness.
and
dumb-
there's two sides to a coin or a medallion.
Hmm.
And there's also usually little ridges around the edge that your thumb would go round.
That's true.
And you flip a coin,
Mhm.
Mhm.
heads or tails.
That's true. And a coin has value. Which so it's a rather like evocative object.
Yeah, a coin is history too, right? You
Yeah.
can date the coin.
Sure, yeah, that's true. It has its own sort of information on it, and
Yeah.
each coin is unique.
So it is not dumb. It is not dumb.
It's this, yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, a coin actually, it does a lot. Like,
Yeah.
they're also, coins are in circulation. It's something that
Yeah.
passes between hands. It's something that
Mhm.
travels very far, and nobody really knows how far it does travel. It's impossible to keep track of a coin.
Yeah.
It's-
But so does a poem. The poem has traveled now.
Right.
We are talking from all over the world.
It goes out into the world, it goes into circulation, and nobody
Yeah.
knows how many thumbs will get on
Yeah.
it, you know?
And there's history to it. We date it. We talked about
Yeah.
the date when it was written,
Yeah.
right?
But
And
it's
also-
also a pretty dumb rhyme.
I mean, the rhyme, yeah, so
With the couplets, yes.
the rhyming couplets is something that I guess we could also talk about. I mean, is this what I mean, does that serve, how does the rhyming, this form, or his observance of form fit with this idea of the poem being this mute coin-like object or something? I mean,
Well,
the rhyme feels different to me. I don't know.
I think it's significant that after 3 couplets that do rhyme, that the moment he said the poem should be wordless, it's the first couplet that doesn't rhyme.
It's true. There's a nice like subtle internal rhyme with word and bird. A poem should be wordless as the flight of birdless. You know, like there's almost it's almost like implied there. It's sort of interesting. It's an interesting like twist on the meter and the rhyme scheme we're getting accustomed to.
It's not a perfect rhyme, but it ends on and we call that a consonance. It is a form of rhyme.
Mm-hmm.
It's certainly not a perfect rhyme.
No. It's a weak rhyme, but it rhymes in a way. Same thing with actually
Force
throughout.
it? Could you force it? A poem should be wordless, like the
Wordless
flight
and
of
birds.
birds. You know, you could force it.
Oh, like as a flight of birds. That's the,
Oh, birds.
Or wordless, like a flight of birds.
Only the yes, I meant.
yeah, I mean, in some ways, he's almost asking you to force that rhyme. There's other instances of this in the other stanzas as well, of playing with these internal rhymes and these weak rhymes. Mean, like the last couplet, a poem should not mean but be. Mean and be, you know, it's definitely not perfect, but I think it's there.
Well, he says the leaning grasses and two lights above the sea. That rhyme. We have it.
Yeah, for love, the leaning grasses and two lights above the sea. A poem should not mean but be. The rhyme scheme is always kind of like drifting in the lines, right? It's showing up in different places.
Well, I wonder if Bob Dylan would use this as a poem or a song. You know, he said if you can sing it, it's a song. So the leaning grasses and two lights above the sea, you know, a poem.
Yeah,
But be.
I can hear it now, Stanley. I think you're right. So
The couplets are important. They structure the poem. And as I said before, sound is important. A poem should be wordless. It refers to sound, not the meaning of the words. I'm still trying to figure out what he means by mute. A poem should be palpable and mute. It's the beginning of the poem. It starts out of nothing. It's a creatio ex nihilo, a creation out of nothing. As God created the world, he starts with sounds and the poem develops. I'm sure that it is important that he starts with that a poem should be mute, and then you have these wordless words and they only represent sounds.
Terry, is this your demonstration of the avocado poem?
The globe fruit.
the globed fruit. No, that's a good point, Mark, of the sort of the creation ex nihilo. I mean, the globe, right? The earth. You know, there's this sort of creation myth that's being echoed here at the beginning. The poem comes out of nothing and it's a globe. Fruit is always, you know, a rather evocative or provocative symbol.
Vanna White.
Yeah, Vanna White indeed.
Thanks, Jerry.
What did you say? Vanna White?
Yeah, Terry is modeling all of the fruits she has in her nearby.
I was just thinking, but isn't that what every poet, every one of us who sits down with a blank page hopes to create something, you know? And so I try to write something every day, and I start with a blank page, and I'm always amazed at what comes out, you know?
I'm remembering, I think Vijaya said irony, and so much of it feels like tongue-in-cheek to me, like he's jabbing, like exceeding the style that he's using.
So maybe let's run with that. So he's in some ways not doing what he says, and it's intentional, right? It's not a failure of the poem or the poet. He's not saying a poem should be like this, but I'm not heeding my own advice. In some ways he's saying, you know, a poem ideally should be like this, but I'm not doing that in this poem. I'm exceeding the style, as you put it so well, CJ, or exceeding the sort of the prescriptions or the limits that I've prescribed on what a poem ought to be, to make a point. So what would that point be? If there's irony here, if Archibald MacLeish is saying like I'm saying one thing, but I mean something else, what is it exactly? Why would he not follow his own advice? Or you know, not advice, but why is he not writing? Why is he not writing a poem that does what he says a poem should do?
I think should.
Go ahead, Jenny.
I think should be quite important, because should is the kind of word that puts most of us off. If we're told we should do something, that's the last thing we want to do. And to start with that in the first line, if we're looking at this as an ironical poem, then should be is sitting in the right place, possibly.
Should, so okay, so should is some right. Should is a very conditional. There's it can both be like imperative, like you should do this, you ought to do this, and it can also be conditional, like it can be like should X happen, then Y, right?
But then look at the last line. Poem should not mean, but be.
Back again.
So he repeats the should again. Oh, he repeats should quite a few times.
That's a very imperative should. A poem should not mean but be. There's a very clear prescription, right? A poem ought to do this, not this, right?
The final two lines are the peak of the poem. He has a poem should be all the time. He repeats that. A poem should be palpable, a poem should be motionless, a poem should be equal. And then he also has a poem should be, but he extends the line to a poem should not mean but be. A poem should be.
Right, so he sort of flips this
Oh, he extends that. He makes it longer to give it more importance. A poem should be, and he inserts not mean but.
I see a lot of the experiment and the language poets in this, the last line. I mean, because they don't care about the meaning, but they just want the poem on the page, whatever their experiments are, right?
That's a really good point, Vijaya. There's a sort of, thanks for bringing it back to the ModPo syllabus.
Modern, yeah.
Right. There's a in the language poets, we might say there's an emphasis on existence or something, right? Like it's almost like existential move, like the materiality, the words themselves are a priori, and then the meaning follows from that. So we can put different sentences together, and there'll be a sort of meaning that emerges from that encounter. And that's the true, that's the meaning that we're after. That's the meaning that's the most important, not the one we get semantically just from reading something. So it's a good point. So there's almost like a kind of material, I mean, for sure throughout there's this emphasis on the materiality of poetry, this comparison to the globed fruit, to the coin, and so forth. These sort of everyday objects that the poem should, according to him, be like. But I think it still begs the question: why is he not doing what he says a poem should do?
I believe he does.
Maybe he is.
What does he?
I mean, related to what Vijaya said at the end, the poem should not mean but be. He maybe he's using words, but it still is being, and so he's created a being, and end of story. I guess that's all I wanted to say.
No, that's a good point.
It's a meta. That's Al's point of meta, right?
Exactly. Right. We come around to the fact that at the end of the poem we have the poem, and the poem is existing. So that's true. So perhaps he has in fact done this, but the poem is also meaning at the same time, right, throughout. So it's a little bit like,
and since meaning doesn't really matter, why do we care for the contradictions and paradoxes? There is no meaning.
Well, then that would make it a language poem.
Yeah.
I like two lines we haven't looked at, which is silent as the sleeve-worn stone of casement ledges where the moss has grown, because you can see physically that that place where the moss has grown, but somebody's been leaning on it and the moss has been worn off. And it doesn't say anything in a literal manner, but it says to you that somebody's been there all the time.
Hmm.
Well, someone's been there, but moss has grown on it as well, and moss
Yes.
doesn't grow on a rolling stone, or whatever the line is. So it's
That's the line.
it's ironic, yeah.
Hmm.
So it's old and moss has grown on it, but at some other time it was worn.
It made me
Yep.
think.
Oh, I think
Uh,
it's worn between the moss. I think it's mossy, but there's a place where the moss has been rubbed off by the elbow.
Ooh, sleeve-worn stone of casement ledges where the moss has grown. So somebody's leaning out of the window, is that,
I think so.
and rubbing it like, so rubbing the stone or rubbing the moss? Yeah, this is a really interesting couplet.
Rubbing the moss off the stone is what I think of, because I can think of times that you do that. You lean on something that hasn't been leant on for years, and whatever's grown on it, you knock off with your elbow.
Mhm.
To me, it seemed the other way around. At first, people were hanging out of the window, make the stone sleeve worn. Then people
And the moss
stopped,
grows on it. Yeah,
and,
it's like
and then people stopped looking out, and it became moss grown, and that made me think about the two of the last couplets: for all the history of grief, an empty doorway and a maple leaf, and for love, the leaning grass and two lights above the sea, which are two metaphors that have been used so much that we don't want to use it anymore. Like that people have used it so often, have looked out that window so much that we want to stop looking at it that way.
Can you come back to the history of grief, an empty doorway and a maple leaf, because that's the couplet which I've least been able to make any sense of.
Oh yeah, when we I looked it up this morning. Another when I was looking for "silent as the leaf-worn stone," and it's when you Google it, you only get interpretations of this poem. And there was one interpretation that said, for all the history of grief, that's only you can use an empty doorway or a maple leaf as sufficient metaphor for the whole history of grief, so you don't need any other poems for that. So that was what I had in my head when I made this comment.
Interesting.
But history is of interest. It isn't the past, it's history. It's what we make of the past, our interpretation of the past. We interpret grief.
We have experienced it throughout history. Everybody has had some grief at one point.
Yes, but the importance is that it is the history, not the past, not what has happened before, but what we make of the past.
Memory.
Not the instances, but the history. Yeah.
Right. Memory is more past, right? It's not really history, or it can be history.
When I Googled Sir Archibald, he said that he viewed World War I as ending of the old world, and a new world that he sensed rather than understood. And so this poem was written in 1926 after that, and he was really trying to understand what was going on in the world. But he did view the end of World War I as a turning point.
And I suppose there's some, if this is in fact written in the 20s, as Mark indicated earlier, then this is in the aftermath, right, of the war. So perhaps there's some of that history of grief, I suppose, in here. I do want to come back to the line like that. So yeah, I mean, I do think that the history of grief and love, like these are rather puzzling. But I do want to puzzle over the earlier line that Jenny had called our attention to. Silent is the sleeve-worn stone of casement ledges where the moss has grown. Since we all seem to have a different interpretation of actually what is, what that image is, right? Like whether somebody is like leaning out of the moss worn window, or somebody was leaning, and you can see the traces of the human trace beneath the moss, which has now grown in this over this old window or abandoned building, right? I think it's there's an interesting interplay between human traces and nature here that I think is really crucial for understanding, perhaps for unlocking the mysteries of this poem.
Okay, so a poem should be motionless in time as the moon climbs. Now, as the moon climbs would imply time going by, but in reality, the moon is not climbing. We're going around.
But it looks like it.
Right. No, that's true. Well, I mean, the moon is right. The moon doesn't climb. The moon does orbit the Earth, but so there's some sort of like optical illusion, right, or something that has to do with the human standpoint,
right,
the way that we can perceive the heavens, which actually move in a way that's different from anything that we can observe because of the scale of it. So there's something. There's also a sort of nature-human interplay there as well, right? Like what the natural world does versus how we can observe it,
perceive it. How we record it. We say the moon climbs. The moon's rising. We say that every single day and night. Moon rise, moon set.
Sunrise.
It's poetic tradition and the imagination.
Sorry?
It's a poetic tradition. You have that in poetry, you have that in literature. It's old-fashioned, it's archaic, it's our imagination that we are the center and everything moves around us.
Right.
And in reality, by 1920, the theory of relativity that had already happened, and we know that time is symmetrical forward and backward. We already have this sense that we just don't know the future. But the future is already out there. We can calculate it.
Right.
Time can be minus or plus a figure. It doesn't matter. There's no difference in physics between past and present, past and future. And that's known by 1920. The theory of relativity was in the teens.
We also have those two lines twice in the center of the poem. So they're the only lines that are repeated twice.
Which ones?
A poem should be
motionless in time as the moon climbs is the start and the end of that central stanza of the poem. So those two lines are central to the poem.
No, I found them really interesting as well because they reminded me of what it means for like a piece of work or poetry to be like canonical and to be part of the canon. Because I think for like a poem or like a piece of writing to really kind of stay the same over time and kind of have the same value for a number of generations. I mean, it can't change because it has been written at some point, but the meaning that we kind of say it has, that changes over time. So that basically is like the moon. We think it changes. For us, it does, but it never actually changes. It always stays the same.
Yeah.
Really good point. And brings us back to this sort of objectivity of the natural world versus the perceptions on it by the human world. Right. So the poem is moon-like. I think that's strongly implied in this section of the poem. Motionless time has to do with the perspective on it changing, that the poem sort of is almost this ancient thing like the moon that will always be there and always has been there, and it's more just on a day-to-day basis, our orientation in the cosmos is what it causes it to appear different, rather than anything that the moon itself is doing. Oh, Stanley, the eights and the phases of the moon.
Yeah.
So,
because a stanza is circular, so it's like kind of it's making that circular kind of thing that that the loop of like the moon, the lunar thing, how we are connected to the moon. So I think, that's why he repeats the 2 lines again to make it like a full circuit.
Oh, right. That's a good point. Yeah. The cycles of the moon.
Yeah.
Is always follows the same cycle, and will, for not forever, but like as far as humans are concerned, it will be forever.
And the two couplets in between those 2 lines, leaving the moon releases and leaving the moon behind winter leaves. I mean, those are pretty powerful lines.
Yeah.
Have you noticed that the poem has 24 lines? The day has 24 hours. It's a cycle.
Oh, interesting.
Wow, that's
It's
interesting.
divided in 3 as sort of morning, afternoon, and night, right?
Yeah, but I'm still wondering why eight lines for couplets. I was thinking of the week, but the week has 7 days. So the 8th day is when we go back to the first day of the week again.
So it's sort of the end.
But the poem is repetitive. It starts by a poem should be, and then it ends with a poem should be again.
And you can see where not mean in the last line, poems should not mean, which is it should be mute, and it should be, which is palpable. So we're going around.
Yeah. I also noticed that that thing about the grief, which Jenny was talking about, for all the history of grief, that has to go with the first 2 lines. When we read it with the first 2 lines, a poem should be equal to, not true, for all the history of grief, where he says that the poem need not actually portray the full history, the detailed history, but just like some symbols, just a few brush strokes, which will indicate of what the whole. So like, because maybe he's talking about memories of the war, grief.
I think it's important to notice the time frame. I didn't know it was 1926, but the whole globe was so affected by the First World War. And already the beginning of the second is happening. This
The 20s are a complicated time. I think
Max, you asked us about the moss, casement ledges where the moss has grown. That reminded me of Mosses from an Old Man's by Nathaniel Hawthorne. It goes to tradition, and the first 8 lines they are about tradition. As a globed fruit, you mentioned that it is provocative. It's the fruit of knowledge. It's Genesis, or the tree of knowledge, the fall of man, the fall of Adam and Eve. It's provocative. It has some erotic illusions. Poetry started as love poetry. Maybe that is what he has in mind. The old medallions are old, and with the adjective old, they are even older than usual medallions. And then, as I said before, the moss is from an old man's, and Nathaniel Hawthorne was quite traditional. He was a customs officer in the true sense of the word. He was a customs officer, and he also cared for customs traditions. He's playing with that expression all the time. And MacLeish is in the same tradition.
Does anybody want to respond to that?
Yeah, so the irony that we feel some irony that he is trying to break from it. It's just so great that first set of couplets, the last one doesn't really work unless you force it, as we did. That was great. So it's trying to break it. I was just, I pulled up at the same time the Ars Poetica of Ashbery, who's more like a language poet. The Uts Poetica is her name, and I think Uts Poetica is the Hector thing. And it's
Victor Poetic is her name, yeah.
That's right, c'est vrai. So just, just for a moment, just the jangle of words in a clump, like we've been looking at in language poetry, this is so much clearer. He's not going all the way to complete abstraction and incomprehension. He's not doing a May Bersenberger in these thoughtful lines that we can't make anything of. We can, and we have for this for the moss on the ledge. We could probably dissect it down to the point where we have two interpretations at most, not really anymore. It's pretty clear. So it's different, but it's starting to. It's not just one. It's not that clear. It's not explanatory. It's not legalese. It can be ambiguous and should not mean but be. At the end, he's really going there.
I've put the Ashbery poem that you referenced here in the chat, which is a fun sort of take on the Ars Poetica. I mean, fun.
He is
complicated. Yeah, he is fun. He is fun. I don't think he needs to be fun, like haha fun, but more like he's having fun with it, but to make a more profound point. And it starts with, you can't say it that way anymore. That's the first line of his sort of Ars Poetica, of Ashbery's Ars Poetica. You can't say it that way anymore, which is such a forceful or a much more imperative version of MacLeish's "A poem should be palpable and mute." And it comes right back to this question of speaking, meaning making, right? You can't say it that way anymore. Saying in some ways like shut up, right? Like this is a sort of different kind of muteness than MacLeish's muteness and quietness. This sort of he sort of like, it's a sort of escalation in some ways of what MacLeish is doing, where MacLeish is saying, a poem should be this, a poem shouldn't be this, a poem, and so forth. And Ashbery is just coming out and saying, no, a poem, it's a question of ethics and morals, like don't do this or something, right? I think the Ashbery it's much more complicated than that. It's not as like programmatic, but it's interesting to read that first line in relation, to the first line of this MacLeish poem, and to think about how this tradition of the Ars Poetica really does start with poets sitting down and saying, okay, a poem should be this and it shouldn't be that, and this is the starting point. And it has something to do with meaning making, and it has something to do with saying something one way and not saying it another way, or letting something speak for itself, or shutting up or something like that. It's about like drawing these lines in the sand and trying to figure out like what a poem is or should be or should do.
Do you think that all of these Ars Poetica poems are like written by people who are teaching a class about how to write a poem?
Not necessarily. I think it's a sort of, it's a tradition going back to Horace, right? That like there's some sort of the poets as the sort of keepers or stewards of their craft and profession, from time to time have to reflect on what they do and sort of say what it is what it is they imagine they're doing, right? And there's a sort of gatekeeping to it in a way, right? Like the sort of masters of the form of the craft are saying, this is how it should be, and everyone else is are just pale imitators or something.
To explain their art.
Hmm?
And they also try to explain their arts.
Right.
You also have that in Renaissance theater, where they have that in the plays that they explain what they are doing on stage.
Right. That's true. And the sort of the play within a play device that's very common as well, right? This sort of meta gesture that is kind of it's harder to pull off in other art forms. You can't. I don't know. Can you make a sculpture that's about what a sculpture should be? I mean, in a way, like every time you make a sculpture, I guess you are in some way saying what a sculpture should be, right? But it's not able to get that next level of
you can only have that in literature.
Yeah, Rodin was doing that at the turn of the 20th century. You leave the marks of your tool in the work.
Right. That's a really good point, Terry. Yeah, thanks for being in that art historical.
There was a French sculptor who once made this. How do you call it in English? The contraption where the thing usually is on. So a big block of stone.
A pedestal.
Yeah. And he made an empty one, and he wrote the world, Le Monde, upside down. So, so he made this the last sculpture, which is everything. So, so it's possible to make
right. No, that's
some kind of meta sculpture.
Yeah, I suppose there are different ways in which we can find this in like the plastic arts, right, and visual arts and stuff.
I really want to show you. I just looked it up. My favorite, one of my favorite Dutch poets. He died 2 years ago. He was called K. Schippers. And when the thing says a poem should be wordless as the flight of birds, it made me think about this. Let me show you. This is called line.
Oh.
And that's the first. The second is called line in text, and that is a the same line in a piece. It's from a newspaper, and the third is called text, and that's all the letters that the line goes through, and he explains it that he was reading the newspaper, and there was a fly who landed on the newspaper, and he wrote down the letters that he was walking on, and after a while it flew away, and he drew the line and made 3 poems out of it. So that's yeah, I really love that.
That's chance poetry. That's chance poetry, right?
And
that's going to come the coming week.
And it's wordless and it's meaningless, and it is. So.
And I mean, there are so many examples of that contemporary with MacLeish and after MacLeish, right? Like obviously after, but also, you know, contemporary with MacLeish of poets who are actually like experimenting, right? Being like high modernist or eventually like playing with things like Eliot's word poetry or shape poems.
I'm just reading about Schippers, and he's a neo-Dadaist. Basically, is what they call him.
That's a very Dada move. It reminds me of.
It's a very Dada move, but he's later. He's 50s. When Dada was being revived. There's a good story in the New Yorker magazine this week about John Donne, and the first paragraph is that you can tell what's popular in poetry whether John Donne is in or out, because he wasn't a technician, he was a thinker. So I think he's realizing, I think MacLeish is realizing that we're going for thinkers now.
Mm.
Well, that's what he said. They said the change in MacLeish was after World War I, when he became more sensitive to what was going on, but he couldn't really explain it. I just wonder, Max, how Al would pull all this together so we could get onto the tarantula.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the answer is implied by the fact that there's no MacLeish in the syllabus. But I think as far as I know, unless it's like one of them snuck on to ModPo Plus, I don't know. I don't think so though. Yeah, I think that I think we did good work of playing with the ironic or not playing, not everything's playing, of looking at the ironic distance between what MacLeish is saying and what he's doing, right? And thinking of that as being a very telling distance, that there's an incongruity, and that says something about how MacLeish imagines this this project of writing, the ultimate poem, what a poem should be, or also perhaps also the projects of Ars Poetica in general, this idea of prescribing what a poem should be in poetry, like it's actually sort of while it's potentially like a very radical meta thing, it's also like kind of difficult, right? Like it's sort of hard to do that reflection, right? And to do it sort of in a pure way that honors your intentions. And I think that there's that slippage there between what he says and what he does is kind of telling.